Reports from the press. Good morning. You're welcome to attend the State Council Information Office press conference. Today, the State Council Information Office is going to release the white paper, China's position on the China-U.S. economic and trade consultation, and host a press conference here to give you our briefing as well as interpretation of this white paper. Today we are very honored to have with us Mr. Wang Shouwen, Vice Minister of Commerce and Deputy China International Trade Representative. I'm Guo Weiming, Vice Minister of the State Council Information Office, and I'm honored to moderate this press conference. First of all, I'd like to give you a short briefing about the white paper. This white paper, China's position on the China-U.S. economic and trade consultation, gives a comprehensive review and introduction of the evolution of China-U.S. economic and trade frictions and consequent consultations. It outlined the principal position of the Chinese government on the consultations. With about 8,300 characters, this white paper is composed of preface, main contents, and conclusions. The white paper stressed that the China-U.S. commercial relationship serves as the ballast and propeller of the overall bilateral relationship. At stake are the fundamental interests of the two peoples and the prosperity and stability of the world. In response to the economic and trade friction unilaterally initiated by the U.S. since March 2018, China has had to take forceful measures to defend the interests of the nation and its people. At the same time, committed to resolving disputes through dialogue and consultation, China has engaged in multiple rounds of negotiations with the U.S. in efforts to stabilize the bilateral commercial relationship. China does not want a trade war, but it is not afraid of one, and it will fight one if necessary. China's position on this issue has never changed. The white paper stresses that economic and trade friction provoked by the U.S. damages the interests of both countries and of the wider world. The U.S. imposed tariffs harm others and of no benefit to the U.S. itself, impeding two-way trade and investment cooperation and undermining market confidence and economic stability in the two countries and globally. The trade war does not make America great again. Rather, they have increased U.S. production costs, triggered U.S. domestic price hikes, affected U.S. economic growth and people's livelihood, and hampered U.S. exports to China. U.S. trade bullying harms the world as it goes against the WTO rules, damages the multilateral trading system, undermines market confidence, and poses a serious challenge to global economic recovery and a major threat to the trend of economic globalization. The white paper stresses that the U.S. has backtracked on its commitments in the U.S.-China consultations as the economic and trade friction started by the U.S. hit bilateral trade and investment relations. Both sides believed it necessary to come to the negotiating table to seek a solution through consultations. The consultations started in February 2018 and came a long way. The two sides agreed on most parts of the deal, but the consultations have not been free of setbacks, each of them being the result of U.S. breach of consensus and commitments and backtracking. The U.S. government should bear the sole and entire responsibility for these severe setbacks in China-U.S. economic and trade consultations. The white paper stresses that China is committed to consultation based on equality, mutual benefit, and good faith. The Chinese government rejects the idea that threats of a trade war and continuous tariff hikes can ever help resolve trade and economic issues. Guided by a spirit of mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefit, the two countries should push forward consultations based on good faith in order to resolve issues through talks. The white paper also stresses that a precondition for concluding an agreement that during consultations, a country's sovereignty and dignity must be respected. Any agreement reached by the two sides must be based on equality and mutual benefit. China will not back down on major issues of principles. In the conclusion, the white paper stresses that striking a mutually beneficial and win-win agreement serves the interests of China and the U.S. and meets the international expectation. It is hoped that the U.S. can pull in the same direction with China, manage economic and trade differences, strengthen economic and trade cooperation, and jointly advance the China-U.S. relations based on coordination, cooperation, and stability for the well-being of the two countries and the world. The white paper will be released in Chinese, English, French, Russian, German, Spanish, Arabic, and Japanese by People's Press and the foreign language press, and it can be purchased at Xinhua bookstores nationwide. So that's the end of my briefing. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Wang Shouwen, Vice Minister of Commerce and Deputy China International Trade Representative, to give his interpretation. Thank you, Vice Minister Guo Weiming. Friends from the press, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Today, the State Council Information Office will release the white paper on China's position on the China-U.S. economic and trade consultations. Thank you for taking time at weekends to attend this press conference. And just now, Vice Minister Guo has given you a briefing on the main contents of the white paper. And please allow me to add some few points. First, China-U.S. economic and trade consultations have received close attention from the international community and been a subject of rumors and speculations. To clarify the facts and China's position, the Chinese government has prepared this white paper entitled China's Position on the China-U.S. Economic and Trade Consultations. It provides an overall picture of the China-U.S. economic and trade consultations and presents China's policy position by laying out the impact of the economic and trade friction, the backtrackings of the U.S. in the course of the consultations, and the principles and position of China regarding the consultations. So China believes that as the two largest economies in the world, China and the U.S. stand to gain from cooperation and lose from confrontation. Our bilateral trade and economic relations are critical to the fundamental interests of the two peoples and the prosperity and stability of the global economy. Since the establishment of diplomatic relations 40 years ago, China and the U.S. have embraced the opportunities of economic globalization, leveraged the complementarity of our two economies, and made a historic leap forward in expanding and diversifying bilateral trade and economic cooperation. So trade in goods between China and the U.S. grew from to $2.5 billion in 1978 when diplomatic relations were established to $633.5 billion in 2018, a 252-fold increase. Trading services exceeded $125 billion, and two-way investment approached $160 billion. China-U.S. bilateral trade and economic cooperation has grown to unprecedented breadth and depth. As the links between the two economies become increasingly closer, the two countries and the two peoples enjoy substantial benefits, bringing more prosperity and stability to the world economy. Given their different development stages and economic systems, it is natural for the two countries to have differences and frictions in their commercial cooperation. This means the two countries should strive to solve problems, resolve frictions, and bridge differences through dialogue and consultation. with a cool-headed and a cooperative position, so that the bilateral commercial relationship will proceed along the track of cooperation. Since it took office, the new U.S. administration has ignored the interests of China, the U.S., and even the entire world, as well as the mutually beneficial and the win-win nature of China-U.S. commercial cooperation. Under the pretexts of trade deficits and intellectual property, it provoked frequent economic and trade frictions and imposed unilateral tariff measures against China. In response, China had to take forceful measures to defend the interests of the country and the people. At the same time, committed to the basic position of resolving disputes through dialogue and consultation, China has engaged in multiple rounds of economic and trade consultations with the U.S. in an effort to stabilize the bilateral commercial relationship. China's position has been consistent and clear. That is, when it comes to the differences between China and the U.S. on the economic and trade front, China is willing to work together with the U.S. to find solutions and to reach a mutually beneficial and a win-win agreement. However, cooperation has to be based on principles. There are bottom lines in consultations, and China will not compromise on major issues of principle. Just as President Xi Jinping stressed, cooperation is the only correct choice for China and the U.S. China remains committed to running its own affairs well, no matter how the external environment changes. It is hoped that the U.S. will pull in the same direction with China, and in a spirit of mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefits, manage differences and stream cooperation, and jointly advance China-U.S. commercial relations in a stable and healthy manner for the well-being of both countries and the world. Thank you. Now the floor is open for questions and answers. Please identify yourself before raising questions. Today we have simultaneous interpreting, but when you raise your questions in English, we have consecutive interpreting. Now the floor is open. The journalist on the second row. So from CGTN, my question goes to Vice Minister Wang. Recently, senior U.S. officials accused China of backtracking, so leading to the stagnation in the consultations. So what's your comment on that? It is also said that China has substantially deleted the draft text of the agreement, leading to the fall apart of the negotiations. Thank you. So when it comes to the China always exercise maximum sincerity in consultations. It is irresponsible of U.S. to accuse China and smear China. So I want to stress that in consultations, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So there is no so-called backtracking in consultations. So
nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
In December last year, our two presidents reached important consensus in their meeting in Argentina. They agreed that negotiations should be conducted to resolve economic and trade frictions, with the ultimate objective of resolving all additional tariffs imposed by both sides. The Chinese side is committed to this presidential consensus. In the interest of China-U.S. economic and trade trade relations, China has always been cool-headed and exercised restraint. With maximum sincerity and patience, we have responded to the U.S. concerns. However, so for many issues raised by the U.S. side, the Chinese side has overcome various difficulties and come up with practical measures. However, when you give them an inch, the U.S. wants a yard. So the U.S. insists on their unreasonable high requests, and they insist that some compulsory requirements that interfere China's sovereignty should be included in the agreement. They also insist that some tariff measures will remain put in place after the conclusion of the agreement. And they also increased tariff hikes in order to exert pressure on China, leading to the escalation of the frictions and the severe setback of our negotiations. So all these facts have shown very clearly that who should take responsibility for the current status of the negotiations. China always stresses that negotiations should always be based on mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefit. By saying mutual respect, it means that each party should respect the other party's sovereignty and core interests. By saying equality and mutual benefit, it means that the two parties should make a compromise. It is not just one party makes compromise. And by saying equality and mutual benefit, it means that the two parties in the negotiations are equal-footed, bringing mutual benefits to both sides.
And if one side doesn't respect the other side's sovereignty and core interests, and tries to force the other side to compromise by pressuring to yield lopsided results, then such negotiations cannot succeed. If the U.S. wants to use extreme pressuring and all kinds of ways to escalate trade frictions, to force China to capitulate, this is impossible. Thank you. Let's continue. The lady in the fifth row, please. Thank you. From Economic Daily, the U.S. says that in China-U.S. economic trade frictions, China is the bigger loser, and the U.S. only suffers limited impact. What is your view? There are no winners in trade war. U.S. tariff measures on China do not only affect China, but also hurt the United States, and also the interests of global economic growth. Such trade restrictions' impact on the United States, I believe, is best illustrated by U.S. research. For example, the U.S. says that China has a huge trade surplus with the United States. Through trade war, the U.S. trade deficit can be reduced. But actually, last year, according to U.S. statistics, U.S. trading goods deficit increased by 10.4%, and U.S. soybean exports to China dropped by 50%. U.S. automotive exports to China also declined. So this shows that the deepening trade restriction measures hurt the interests of U.S. workers and farmers. Additional tariffs also hurt the interests of U.S. consumers. According to a research by the IMF, additional U.S. tariffs on Chinese exports are almost completely borne by U.S. consumers. Research of Federal Reserve Bank of New York shows that each household will have extra spending of $831. Trade frictions will also bring pressure on U.S. employment. A U.S. institute called Trade Partnership did a research showing that if the U.S. imposes additional tariffs on all Chinese exports to the United States, the U.S. will lose 2.23 million jobs. Such trade frictions and restrictions by U.S. own research will cause losses to the United States and will also affect the world economy. Such trade frictions disrupt global value chains as well as global economic and trade order, dampening global investment confidence. The statistics of UNCTAD shows that in 2017 and 2018, global cross-border investment both dropped by double digits. And the U.S. started the trade frictions, hurting the confidence of investors with an adverse impact on global economy. We have lots of foreign journalists here today in the fourth row.
Hi, I'm from Reuters News. I want to ask whether Xi Jinping will meet with Donald Trump at the G20 this month. And should they meet, what sorts of topics, what specific trade issues might they be talking about?
好，请翻译一下。OK。
我来自英国路透社。我的问题是，今年本月在日本举行的 G20 峰会上，习近平主席是否会和特朗普总统会面？如果会面的话，他们两人将讨论哪些议题，尤其是哪些贸易议题？
谢谢你的提问。
Thank you for your question.
我没有这方面的消息可以给你提供。
I don't have the information at hand.
好，那咱们继续啊。OK， 最后一排那位。
Let's continue. The gentleman in the last row.
Hi, I'm from Bloomberg. It seems from what you said today that you blame the U.S. for the breakdown of talks. What gesture or what kind of statement of sincerity does the U.S. have to do to bring China back to the table? Is the next step, from your perspective, the U.S. having to make the next move, or is there some kind of trust building that you could go through? My second question is. Will Liu He be going to the trade minister meeting in Tsukuba in Japan next week? And if not, will there be any contact between the U.S. and the Chinese negotiating teams, either in Tsukuba or at the finance minister meeting, which Yi Gang will be attending? Thank you.
来自彭博新闻社，我的问题是，目前在我看来呢，中方把谈判破裂的责任归咎于美方。那么，请问中方希望美方做出什么样的姿态来显示谈判的诚意，从而使得双方能够重新回到谈判桌？也就是说，下一步，是否希望美国先做出一些举措，包括双方如何建立互信，来进一步推进磋商？第二个问题是，请问刘鹤副总理是否计划出席下周在日本举行的G20 贸易部长会？是否中方和美方的谈判磋商团队在这过程当中有相关的接触，也包括易纲行长是否也会在出席 G20 的相关会议期间与美方进行接触？
谢谢你的提问。
Thank you for your questions.
中美经贸磋商已经
China-U.S.
进
economic
行
and
了
trade
11
consultations have been
就
held
在第
on
11
for
轮
11
磋
rounds.
商期间，
During the 11th round,
将从中国进口的2000亿美元的商品加征关
the
税由
U.S. raised
10%提高到
additional
20%。
tariffs of 10% to 25% on $200 billion of Chinese exports to the United States.
对来自中国的
And also,
3000
the
亿美元
U.S. announced
一个程序，
that it had started the procedures to
是否
raise
要征税。
tariffs on the remaining $300 billion of Chinese exports. The U.S. also abused export control measures to include some Chinese companies in the export control entity list, unduly escalating trade
经贸
frictions
磋商严重受挫，
and also causing a severe setback to the economic and trade
应
consultations,
该承担的。
for which the U.S. should
中
assume
美
full
两国
responsibility.
元首在阿根廷达成的共识就是，
On
双
the two
方
presidents' consensus in
不再
Argentina
提高
is that the two sides
加征的关税的税率，
will
不
not
再对
raise
新的产品
additional tariffs
这个加征关税，
on
而且
new
共
goods.
识是谈判的方向。
And the
如果磋商
consensus
的
is
谈判
that
方向是要取消各自
We want
所
to
增加的
eliminate the
现在
additional tariffs imposed on each other
这些
through
事
consultations
都是
and
美
negotiations.
方所做出的。
So the U.S.
至于
is behind
在
all the
日
developments
本开的会，
of late.
我想呢，
As for the
在
meetings
朱
to be
波
held in
在
Japan,
朱波的这个经贸部长会议，
you mentioned
中方
the trade and economic ministers meeting to be held in Japan. China will definitely have representatives at the
咱
meeting.
们继续提问。
Let's continue.
这第一排，
In the first row. Thank you. From CNR, some time ago, the U.S. has been accusing Chinese companies of acquiring U.S. intellectual property and cutting-edge technologies, and also said that the Chinese government instructed Chinese businesses to acquire U.S. companies to access such technologies and intellectual property. What is your response? Thank you for your question. In terms of intellectual property, China has done lots of work. So China's own intellectual property is getting increasingly important for China. Last year, China's patent applications reached 1.5 million, which made China the world's #1 for 8 years in a row. Of course, while creating and inventing ourselves, China also has IP trade with other countries. We buy intellectual property from other countries and also export intellectual property rights to other countries. In terms of China's procurement, in 2001, China only paid $1.9 billion in IP royalties. But last year, we paid $35.6 billion in IP royalties, an increase of nearly 19-fold, including $8.64 billion paid to the United States, which is nearly a quarter of the total. So we can tell China pays high attention to IP protection. Only by doing so can we see more and more inventions by China. And only by doing so will other countries be willing to sell their intellectual property to China. And China's IP legislation, enforcement, and judiciary have done lots of work to come this far. Chinese government is not involved in Chinese businesses' acquisition or export of intellectual property with other countries. What the Chinese government does is to create an environment that really supports and protects intellectual property, so that intellectual property can be better protected to promote invention and the development of innovative economy. You also mentioned that some people say that the Chinese government instructed Chinese businesses to acquire companies in the United States to have access to advanced technologies. This is not true. Chinese businesses' investment decisions abroad, including what to buy and what not to buy, are completely their own decisions. And they're responsible for their own decisions. They make independent decisions and assume their risks independently. The Chinese government is not involved in these business actions. We don't instruct businesses to acquire certain projects or technologies. Even with such requirements, the Chinese businesses wouldn't listen to the government's instructions or requirements. Thank you. Let's continue. The gentleman in the third row. Thank you. From Phoenix TV. We see that since March last year, the trade frictions have been going on for a year. On multiple occasions, the U.S. administration emphasizes that the big deficit of the U.S. government, $150 billion, and the U.S. has lost millions of manufacturing jobs, and the U.S. is taken advantage of in this process. So how does China respond to U.S. on arguments? Thank you.
谢谢。
Thank you for your question.
你说的很对，经常
You are right.
有一些
It is quite often that there are some people saying China is running a huge trade surplus with United States, who is being ripped off by China. However, trade surplus and deficit have nothing to do with being taken advantage of. For example, U.S. is running a trade surplus with Australia. Australia is running a trade surplus with China, and then China runs a trade surplus with the United States. So you can see in this circle of trade surplus and deficit, each and every country runs some trade surplus and then deficit with some other countries. So we cannot say that trade surplus or deficit has something to do directly with being ripped off. Even if there is a huge trade deficit of U.S. with China, it is still not consistent with the fact. It is fair to say that the U.S. statistics are highly overestimated. For example, last year, the U.S. trade in goods with China, trade deficit reached $419.1 billion. For the accuracy of this figure, our two departments, U.S. Department of Commerce and the China's Ministry of Commerce, conducted a joint study on this statistical issue. And we have found in our joint study that the U.S. statistics are about 20% overestimated. At the same time, we should also consider that a large part of China-U.S. trade is processing trade. In this processing trade between our two countries, China actually imports parts and components from third countries, then assemble them and export to the United States. So these imported contents should not be included in our two-way statistics. And another thing is the trade in services. According to U.S. statistics, United States runs a huge trade surplus with China in trade in services. So taking all these into consideration, our conclusion is that the United States runs a trade deficit of $153.6 billion rather than $419.1 billion. Even in this trade deficit of $153.6 billion, you cannot say that China takes advantage of the United States, because in our two-way trade, about 45% of the Chinese exports actually come from foreign invested enterprises operating in China, and 53% of them come from processing trade. In this processing trade, China just gets some meager processing fees, while the United States have handsome benefits in terms of design, supply of parts and components, as well as marketing. So United States gains a lot from this processing trade. However, due to its price competitiveness, it has reduced the retail price in the United States to the benefit of the U.S. consumer. So we cannot say that this kind of trade comes at the expense of the U.S. interests. It is also said by some people that some jobs are lost due to trade with China. According to the research by the U.S. institutes, it is found that the loss of U.S. jobs happened even before China joined the WTO. It was mainly a result of growing productivity. So that's why some jobs are lost in the U.S. manufacturing sector. Therefore, it is groundless to accuse China of U.S. job loss in its manufacturing sector. Actually, there is industrial upgrading in the U.S. manufacturing sector with more and more jobs in its services sector. That's why the unemployment rate in the United States is in a record low for decades. So in either manufacturing or services in surplus or deficit, I want to stress that our trade is mutually beneficial and a win-win and also benefits the entire world. Next question.
先请这位啊。
谢谢，是美国有线电视新闻 CNN 的记者。
From CNN. So my question for you is that in the China is getting increasingly tougher on the consultations. For example, rare earth is mentioned, and also the announcement of a list of unreliable entities. Some people believe that this announcement is quite vague about the list of unreliable entities. It may hit some IT technological giants in the United States. It is also said that the arrest of a senior Huawei executive led to the arrest of 2 Canadian nationals in China. So it is speculated that some U.S. executives may also be arrested in China. So some people in the United States are concerned about their safety and security in China. So facing this concern, what's your response? And would you like to clarify China's position about the next stage consultation? Thank you. Thank you for your question. When it comes to its position on the trade war, our position is consistent and clear. China does not want to have a trade war, but if it happens, China is not fearful of a trade war. So for the issues that mentioned by you, I think there are some over-interpretations. For example, for the FedEx issue, China welcomes foreign companies in their law-abiding operations in China. However, if they violate Chinese laws and regulations, they should be investigated in accordance with Chinese laws and regulations. So that is not something that should, for one person to accuse, to point a finger at China. And recently, China introduced the foreign investment law, which stipulates that equal treatment will be given to Chinese and foreign enterprises. The legitimate rights and interests of foreign enterprises in China will be protected. So please rest assured about this. But at the same time, you should also abide by Chinese laws and regulations. And you should conduct your operation under the Chinese legal framework. For example, you mentioned the list of unreliable entities. And my colleagues 2 days ago already explained this list. This list aims at those enterprises that have violated market principles as well as the spirit of contract. Out of non-commercial purposes, they introduce a blockade, cut supply for Chinese enterprises, and introduce other discriminatory measures. It may also hurt China's national security and public interests. So for these practices, those enterprises will be included in our list of unreliable entities. China, by establishing this list, want to uphold a fair and equitable trade order in order to protect the legitimate rights interest of Chinese enterprises. So please do not overinterpret this list. From CGTN. So my question for you, Vice Minister, is that why on this time point the Chinese government published this white paper, and on June 1st, the Chinese authorities also increased the tariffs on some U.S. goods. So what is the position of the Chinese government facing this issue? So I will first take your question, why we issue the white paper on this occasion. Because recently, the trade talks between our two sides have caught a lot of attention in our two countries as well as in the international community. So it is very necessary to give the outside world a comprehensive picture of the evolution of these talks, as well as the position of the Chinese government on the consultations. So I think it is an appropriate occasion to release this white paper. It is also a very important move. Thank you. Thank you for your question. On June 1st, Chinese authorities increased the tariffs on some goods imported from the United States. It is a response made by the Chinese government to the tariff hikes introduced by the U.S. administration. We want to defend the interests of our country, our people, and our business community. It is necessary for us to do so. Thank you. Next question. The lady on the fourth row, please. From China Daily. Recently, some intermediary organizations said that some American companies are facing some challenges, such as a slow custom clearance procedure, more checks, as well as delay in licensing approval. So, for facing these retaliatory measures, what's your position on those measures? And also about your take on the list of unreliable entities. I have taken note of this report released by that intermediary organization, saying that some foreign companies face a slowdown in their customs clearance as well as other issues. I want to stress that for these issues, I'm not sure whether they are true or not, but I want to stress that we have taken these issues seriously by conducting investigations. In general, I want to say that when it comes to customs clearance, the Chinese government has introduced a lot of measures in recent time. For example, we have reduced the requirements on regulatory documents from 86 documents in the past to 46 documents by the end of last year. We will further cut the number of regulatory documents required for customs, and we will also cut the time for the procedures in customs clearance, including the requirements for regulatory documents. At the same time, we will also cut the fees paid by enterprises for customs clearance. So these measures have paid off. For example, last year, according to the World Bank Doing Business Report 2019, it was said that China's business environment has improved. So China will continue its reform. Recently, relevant authorities in China introduced a regulation or a document saying that the number of products for compulsory certification will also be reduced in the sector, in the category of industrial products. So we have taken a lot of measures so that the market will play a more important role in our economy, and so that the government can have more focus and the resources to do that they must do. So for those specific issues confronted by companies, they can report to the local commercial authorities. So, in general, our business environment is good, but for specific issues, please report to the local authorities, and you can also brief your complaints, present your complaints to the relevant authorities. According to the new foreign investment law we introduced in March this year, it is said that China will establish a complaint reporting system. Actually, many Chinese provinces have already established such a mechanism. So I suggest to those enterprises that they can make their grievances through this mechanism. As for the list of unreliable entities, we will introduce specific measures regarding this list soon. Thank you. Next question. The lady on the second row. Thank you. From 联合早报. Is it possible that Huawei will be included in the consultations? And will China put some restriction on the export of rare earth? And when it comes to the list of unreliable entities, what consequences will be for those enterprises?
Well, regarding the list of unreliable entities, I've already answered. The measures will be published soon. Regarding rare earth metals, China has the biggest reserves in rare earth metals. We'd like to meet the justified demand of other countries in rare earth metals. But if some countries use China's rare earth metals to produce products to contain China's development, this is unacceptable by standards of both minds and hearts. As for China-U.S. economic and trade consultations, as I said earlier, economic and trade consultations should be based on mutual respect and should see the two sides pulling the same direction on the basis of mutual benefit and win-win. If this cannot be done, then the consultations would be pointless. Even when there are consultations, we cannot reach an enforceable and sustainable deal. Last question. In the third row. Thank you. From Xinhua News Agency. We are all following the course of China-U.S. economic and trade consultations. The U.S. said that at the G20 summit, the two presidents will meet. The media believe that this is a key for relaunching the negotiations. So are the two sides engaged at the working level? Is there a plan for negotiations? If yes, what kind of trade deal will China accept? Thank you. As I said earlier, China-U.S. trade and economic consultations have suffered severe frustrations because the U.S. raised additional tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods from 10% to 25% and announced the start of procedures for raising tariffs on $300 billion of Chinese exports. And it also abused export control exceptions and included Chinese companies in its entity list for export control. These are the main reasons. On the Chinese side, we have great sincerity. Now, for us to have a deal, the deal has to be mutually beneficial and equal. Let me repeat. If we are to have consultations, the consultations have to be based on mutual respect and see two sides pull in the same direction. And it have to be equal-footed and mutually beneficial. Thank you. This concludes today's press conference. Thank you.